If you're listening to this in Los Angeles, Florida, New York City, Miami, Australia, London right now, it's the perfect time to settle in for a story that spans continents and decades. Whether you're in bed, commuting, or just winding down, I want you to hit that subscribe button right now, because tonight's case is one of the greatest unsolved mysteries of the 20th century. We're going back to September 1961, to a moonlit night in Central Africa, where a plane carrying the world's most powerful diplomat plunged into the forest. 16 people died. One survived just long enough to tell a terrifying story that authorities would spend the next 60 years trying to suppress. This is the story of Dag Hammarskjöld, the second Secretary General of the United Nations, and the night that changed the course of history. Was it an accident, or was it murder? To understand what happened that night, you need to understand who Dag Hammarskjöld was, and why so many powerful people wanted him dead. Born in Sweden in 1905, Hammarskjöld came from political royalty. His father had been Prime Minister of Sweden. Young Dag was brilliant, an economist, a diplomat, a poet who wrote in the margins of his journals about duty and sacrifice. He was appointed Secretary General of the United Nations in 1953 at just 47 years old, the youngest person ever to hold that position. But Hammarskjöld wasn't a figurehead. He believed the UN should be more than a talking shop for powerful nations. He believed it should actively prevent war, protect the vulnerable, and challenge colonial powers. This made him beloved by newly independent nations in Africa and Asia. It also made him dangerous to Western governments and corporations that wanted to maintain their grip on the world's resources. By 1960, the world was watching Africa. Across the continent, countries were throwing off the chains of colonialism. The Belgian Congo, now the Democratic Republic of Congo, had just gained independence after 75 years of brutal Belgian rule. But independence didn't bring peace. It brought chaos. The Congo was mineral-rich, particularly in its southern province of Katanga. This region had vast deposits of copper, uranium, and other valuable resources. On July 11, 1960, just 11 days after independence, a politician named Moise Tshombe declared that Katanga was seceding from the Congo. He wanted to form his own country. Tshombe wasn't acting alone. Behind him stood the Union Minière du Haut-Katanga, a Belgian mining company that controlled Katanga's wealth. Behind them stood the Belgian government, which didn't want to lose access to those resources. And behind them stood Western intelligence agencies, including the CIA, who saw the Congo crisis as another battleground in the Cold War. To protect his breakaway state, Tshombe hired hundreds of white mercenaries from South Africa, Rhodesia, Belgium, and France. These weren't just soldiers of fortune. Many were former colonial officers who believed in white supremacy and saw African independence as a threat to their way of life. The UN deployed peacekeepers to the Congo to prevent the country from splitting apart. Hammarskjöld threw the full weight of his office behind this mission. He didn't just want to end the fighting. He wanted to expel the mercenaries, reunite the Congo, and send a message that the era of colonial exploitation was over. This put him on a collision course with some of the most powerful interests in the world. Mining companies feared losing their profits. Western governments feared losing their influence. White supremacists in southern Africa feared the spread of African nationalism. And all of them had one thing in common. They wanted Hammarskjöld out of the way. By September 1961, the situation had reached a breaking point. UN forces had launched aggressive operations to remove mercenaries from Katanga. Tshombe was cornered. Both the United States and Britain were furious with Hammarskjöld for acting without consulting them. The Secretary General had made too many enemies. On September 13, 1961, Hammarskjöld arrived in Leopoldville, now Kinshasa, the capital of the Congo, to meet with Prime Minister Cyril Adula. Word came that UN forces had engaged Katangi's troops. Hammarskjöld knew he needed to act quickly. He arranged a secret meeting with Tshombe to negotiate a ceasefire. The meeting would take place in Dola, a town in northern Rhodesia, now Zambia, just across the border from Katanga. It had to be secret because Hammarskjöld feared his plane might be targeted if anyone knew his route. But someone did know, and they were waiting. Sunday, September 17th, 1961. Late afternoon. At Njili Airport in Leopoldville, a Douglas DC-6 aircraft sat on the tarmac. The plane was called the Albertina, operated by the Swedish company Transair. It was a reliable workhorse for powerful radial engines, pressurized cabin, capable of carrying 16 people with ease. Hammarskjöld boarded with his team. There was Harold Julian, his American security chief, a former U.S. Marine who had served in the Korean War. There were UN officials, advisors, bodyguards. There was the Swedish flight crew, experienced pilots who had flown this route before. 16 people in total. The flight plan called for a journey of over 1,000 miles, flying southeast across the Congo, then turning east toward Ndola. The weather was good, clear skies, a nearly full moon, perfect flying conditions. The Albertina took off around 5 p.m. local time. For the first few hours, everything seemed routine. The crew radioed their position at regular intervals. They were making good time, but someone else was tracking that flight. We now know that radio communications from Hammarskjöld's party were being intercepted. The UN used encryption devices called CX-52 machines, but both the CIA and National Security Agency had the capability to decrypt those messages. Intelligence agencies knew where Hammarskjöld was going, and they had the means to pass that information to anyone who might want to stop him. The Albertina approached Ndola shortly after midnight on September 18th. The crew made radio contact with the tower, reporting they were overhead the airport and requesting permission to land. The tower gave clearance. The pilots acknowledged. Everything seemed normal. At the airport, Lord Allport, the British High Commissioner to Rhodesia, was waiting. So was Moise Tshombe. They expected Hammarskjöld to land at any moment. But the Albertina never touched down. 9 miles from the airport, in thick forest near a place called Beetle, something happened. Something catastrophic. Witnesses on the ground saw strange things that night. Davidson Semengo, a charcoal burner working in the forest, reported seeing 2 planes flying close together, closer than normal. He heard the engines fade, then grow loud again. Then he saw a flash in the sky, followed by an explosion. He watched one plane crash while another flew away. Dixon Bulini, another charcoal burner, was outside his home with his wife. They saw a large plane with a smaller plane above it. Fire seemed to drop from the small plane onto the big one. Then came an explosion. The large plane spiraled down and crashed. A man named John Gongo described seeing something in the sky coming down in a tilted position, already on fire. He could see flames inside the plane and on the wings. When he approached the wreckage later, he heard the sound of what he thought was a jet flying overhead. These witnesses were certain of what they saw. There was a second plane, and that second plane attacked Hammarskjöld's aircraft. But when they told their stories to the authorities, something disturbing happened. Their testimonies were dismissed. They were told they were unreliable because they lacked education. They were accused of being susceptible to political manipulation. In one official report, their accounts were described as difficult to distinguish between truth, fiction, and imagination. In other words, they were ignored because they were black Africans testifying in a white colonial regime. When the sun rose on September 18, 1961, the crash site should have been found quickly. The plane had been in radio contact with the tower. It had gone silent overhead the airport. Search and rescue should have begun immediately, but it didn't. The airport manager closed down operations. Lord Allport insisted that Hammarskjöld must have decided to go elsewhere. For hours, no search was conducted. Even though witnesses had reported seeing a crash, even though a UN plane was missing, the colonial authorities seemed strangely unconcerned. We now know that local people found the crash site early that morning, around 9 to 9:30 a.m. They reported it to the Northern Rhodesian authorities, but no action was taken. The official story would later claim the crash wasn't discovered until after 3 p.m., when a Royal Rhodesian Air Force pilot spotted it from the air. That's a delay of more than 6 hours. 6 crucial hours. When rescue teams finally arrived at the crash site, they found a scene of devastating destruction. The Albertina had plowed through trees at high speed, shearing off branches before slamming into the ground. The fuselage was about 75 to 80% destroyed by fire. Bodies were charred beyond recognition, except for one. Dag Hammarskjöld's body was found thrown from the wreckage. His chest, spine, and ribs were crushed from the impact. But he had no burns, no fire damage at all. In the intense blaze that had consumed everyone else, Hammarskjöld remained untouched by flame. This strange detail would fuel speculation for decades. Even stranger, 15 of the 16 people on board were dead. But one man was still alive. Harold Julian, the security chief, had somehow survived. He was severely burned, barely conscious, but alive. Rescuers rushed him to Ndola Hospital. And that's when the cover-up began. Julian's first words to authorities should have been the most important evidence in the investigation. Inspector Allen, one of the first officials to interview him, recorded that Julian spoke of explosions on the plane. He said something had happened before the crash, something that suggested the plane had been attacked. Over the next several days, as Julian drifted in and out of consciousness, medical staff heard him say disturbing things. Dr. Lowenthal, who treated Julian, tried to extract information about what happened. Julian said that Hammarskjöld had changed his mind about landing. He said the Secretary General had told the pilots to turn back. Then there was an explosion. A nurse heard Julian say, "I was the only one that got out. All the others were trapped. We were on the runway when Mr. Hammarskjöld said go back." Then there was an explosion. Another nurse heard him refer to sparks in the sky. Dr. Lowenthal was adamant that Julian was lucid and coherent when he made these statements. This wasn't the rambling of a dying man. This was eyewitness testimony from someone who had been on that plane, who had experienced whatever catastrophe brought it down. But senior medical staff dismissed Julian's words. They attributed his statements about sparks to a medical condition called uremia, a buildup of toxins that can cause confusion. They suggested he was too heavily sedated to be taken seriously. They implied his memories were unreliable. In 2019, stunning new evidence emerged. Documents from the government of Zimbabwe revealed that Rhodesian intelligence officials had actively tried to suppress Julian's testimony. A senior intelligence official had instructed Julian's medical superintendent that no one of his hospital staff must talk about this, specifically about Julian's statements that he had seen sparks in the sky. Think about that. A government intelligence officer telling doctors not to talk about what their patient had said about a plane crash. This wasn't medical confidentiality. This was a deliberate effort to keep the truth from coming out. Harold Julian died 5 days after the crash. The only person who could have definitively told the world what happened aboard the Albertina died in that hospital bed, and authorities made sure his testimony would be buried. His son Richard later revealed something his mother had told her sister, that Harold had described 3 explosions on the plane in its final minutes. But by then, the official investigation had already concluded. The narrative was set, and that narrative was simple pilot error. The crew had misjudged their altitude and flown into the trees. A tragic accident. Case closed. But everyone knew it wasn't that simple. 3 official investigations were conducted into the crash between 1961 and 1962. 2 were run by the Rhodesian colonial government. 1 was conducted by the United Nations. All 3 failed to reach a definitive conclusion, though the Rhodesian inquiries eventually settled on pilot error. But these investigations ignored or actively suppressed crucial evidence. The testimony of African witnesses was dismissed as unreliable. Harold Julian's statements about explosions were written off as the confusion of a dying man. The delays in search and rescue were never adequately explained. And most damning of all, evidence of a second aircraft was systematically ignored. Then there was the physical evidence that didn't make sense. Investigators found that several bodies at the crash site had what appeared to be bullet wounds. X-rays showed bullets lodged in tissue. The official explanation was that ammunition stored on the plane had exploded in the fire, and bullets had randomly penetrated bodies. But one investigator, Mr. Franks, noted something odd. Hammarskjöld's bodyguard had a revolver that was severely damaged by heat. yet Hammarskjöld's own body showed no fire damage at all. Harold Julian, the security chief, didn't appear to have any weapon on him when he was found. Where was his service weapon? These questions were never answered. In the decades that followed, evidence continued to emerge that suggested something far more sinister than pilot error. In the 1990s, two of Hammarskjöld's top advisors, Connor Cruz O'Brien and George Ivan Smith, went public with their belief that their boss had been assassinated. They said they had evidence that the plane had been shot down by mercenaries working for Belgian, American, and British mining interests. In 2011, British scholar Susan Williams published a groundbreaking book called Who Killed Hammarskjöld? She had spent years investigating the case, interviewing witnesses, and digging through archives. Her work revealed previously unseen documents from Lord Allport's personal papers. She uncovered testimony from African witnesses who had been silenced by colonial authorities. And she found evidence that Western intelligence agencies had been tracking Hammarskjöld's movements. Williams's work helped establish an independent commission of international jurists in 2012. This Hammarskjöld commission was led by British Judge Stephen Sedley and included prominent legal figures from Sweden, South Africa, and the Netherlands. In 2013, they issued their report. Their conclusion was stark. There is persuasive evidence that the aircraft was subjected to some form of attack or threat as it circled to land at Ndola. But the most explosive evidence came from thousands of miles away from Africa, on a small island in the Mediterranean Sea. Cyprus, September 17th to 18th, 1961. Just after midnight, at a U.S. National Security Agency listening post, a naval officer named Charles Southall was called into work. His supervisor had given him a cryptic message 3 hours earlier. Come in at midnight, something interesting is going to happen. Southall arrived and was directed to a loudspeaker where several other officers had gathered. They listened to a recording that had been intercepted 7 minutes earlier. The signal had come from thousands of miles away, from the skies over Ndola. What Southall heard would haunt him for the rest of his life. He heard the rushing sound of an aircraft engine. Then he heard a pilot's voice, cool and professional. I see a transport plane coming low. All the lights are on. I'm going down to make a run on it. Yes, it is the Transair DC-6. It's the plane. Then Southall heard the sound of gun cannons firing. The pilot's voice came back, this time with excitement. I've hit it. There are flames. It's going down. It's crashing. The recording ended. The officers processed it and sent it to Washington. Southall's testimony was later corroborated by another NSA employee, Paul Abram, who was working at a different listening post in Greece. Abram reported hearing transmissions that night that he believed were from American ground troops. At one point, he heard an accented voice say, "The Americans just shot down a UN plane." For decades, Southall and Abram kept this information to themselves. They had signed secrecy agreements. They couldn't speak publicly without risking prosecution. But in 2011, after Susan Williams's book was published, Southall decided to come forward. He contacted the Hammarskjöld Commission and gave testimony about what he had heard that night. His account was detailed and consistent. He remembered the pilot's words. He remembered the sound of cannon fire. He remembered the excitement in the pilot's voice when he confirmed the hit. The commission found Southall's testimony compelling. They concluded that it was highly likely that the NSA and possibly the CIA had recorded the entire radio traffic over Ndola the night of the crash. If those recordings still exist, they would prove definitively what happened. So the commission filed a Freedom of Information Act request with the U.S. government, asking for any recordings, transcripts, or radio intercepts from the night of September 17th to 18th, 1961. The NSA's response was extraordinary. They acknowledged that documents responsive to the request existed, but they refused to release them, citing national security grounds. These documents were classified top secret, they said, and releasing them could cause exceptionally grave damage to national security. Think about that. More than 50 years after the crash, the U.S. government admitted they have evidence about what happened to Hammarskjöld's plane, but they won't release it. Not because it's too old to matter, because it's too damaging to reveal. What could be in those files that's still so dangerous 60 years later? What truth are they protecting? The most likely explanation is that the intercepts would prove that Western intelligence agencies knew an attack was planned, that they intercepted communications about it, and that they did nothing to stop it. Or worse, that they actively facilitated it. Based on flight records and aircraft availability, investigators believe the attacking plane was likely a Fuga Magister jet fighter. Katanga's Air Force had 3 of these French-made jets, which had been delivered with American assistance. The most likely pilot was a Belgian mercenary named Jan van Rissegem, who flew for Moïse Chambé. In 2014, The Guardian published evidence implicating van Rissegem, but he was never interviewed about the crash. Flight logs were produced showing he wasn't flying that night, though there are questions about whether those logs were falsified. Van Rissegem died in 2007 without ever being questioned about his possible involvement in one of the greatest crimes of the 20th century. In 2017, the United Nations reopened its investigation into Hammarskjöld's death. Mohammed Chand Othman, the former Chief Justice of Tanzania, was appointed to review new evidence and assess what really happened that night in 1961. Othman's work has been painstaking. He has interviewed witnesses, reviewed newly declassified documents, and pressed governments to release information. His reports, issued in 2017, 2019, and most recently in 2024, have gradually built a compelling case. The latest assessment, delivered in October 2024, states that it remains plausible that an external attack or threat was the cause of the crash. Alternative explanations include sabotage or pilot error, but the evidence increasingly points toward deliberate action. Othman has also concluded that it is almost certain that specific, crucial information exists in the archives of member states, particularly the United States, Britain, Belgium, South Africa, and France. These governments have been asked repeatedly to release any relevant documents. Most have refused. Some have provided limited information. None have been fully transparent. The current UN Secretary General, Antonio Guterres, has personally followed up on requests for information. In statements marking anniversaries of the crash, he has called on member states to release what they know. He has said that this may be our last chance to find the truth. But as each year passes, witnesses die. Documents are destroyed or lost. The people responsible for decisions made in 1961 have long since passed away. The window for accountability is closing. What we know for certain is this: Dag Hammarskjöld died pursuing peace. He believed the United Nations could be a force for justice in the world. He challenged powerful interests, mining companies, intelligence agencies, colonial governments, who wanted to maintain their control over Africa's resources and people. He made enemies. And on a moonlit night in September 1961, those enemies may have taken their revenge. 16 people died that night, 15 immediately. One survivor lingered just long enough to tell a story that authorities tried to bury. African witnesses saw a second plane and were dismissed as unreliable. An American intelligence officer heard a pilot boast about shooting down a UN aircraft and was forced into silence by classification rules. Evidence was suppressed, testimonies were ignored, and for 60 years, the truth has been kept locked away in government archives. Was it an accident, or was it murder? The evidence suggests we know the answer. But until governments release what they're hiding, until those classified files are opened, until the full truth comes out, we can't say for certain. What we can say is this: Dag Hammarskjöld's death changed history. It emboldened those who wanted to preserve colonial power. It weakened the UN at a crucial moment, and it sent a chilling message to anyone who might challenge the established order. You can be touched, even if you're the world's top diplomat. The investigation continues. New evidence emerges every few years. Witnesses keep coming forward. Researchers keep digging. And somewhere, in locked filing cabinets in Washington, London, Brussels, and Pretoria, the truth still waits. Maybe one day, we'll know for certain what happened in the skies over Ndola on September 18, 1961. Maybe we'll learn who gave the order, who pulled the trigger, and why so many governments have spent 60 years hiding the truth. Until then, This remains one of the great unsolved mysteries of the 20th century. The death of the man who believed the world could be united in peace. The diplomat who died in flames. The Secretary General who knew too much. The death of Dag Hammarskjöld. If you made it to the end of this investigation, thank you for listening. If you're lying there in Lagos wondering what really happened, you're not alone. Millions of people around the world have asked the same question for 6 decades. Subscribe for more deep dives into history's darkest mysteries. And remember, sometimes the most important stories are the ones powerful people don't want you to know. Sleep well, if you can. Story 2. If you're settling in for the night in California, Texas, New York City, Ohio right now, you've chosen the perfect time for this story. Whether you're trying to fall asleep or just unwinding after a long day, hit that subscribe button before we begin. Because what I'm about to tell you will stay with you long after you close your eyes. It's December 30th, 2000, the final weekend of the millennium. In a quiet Tokyo suburb, a family of 4 is preparing to celebrate the new year. A father, a mother, an 8-year-old daughter, and a 6-year-old son. They have no idea that in just a few hours, an intruder will enter their home through a second-floor bathroom window. He will murder all 4 of them. And then, in an act so bizarre it defies explanation, he will stay in their house for hours. He'll eat their ice cream, use their computer, take a nap on their couch. And when he finally leaves, he'll abandon enough evidence to solve a dozen murder cases. DNA, fingerprints, blood-stained clothing, even his own feces left unflushed in their toilet. 24 years later, despite one of the largest criminal investigations in Japanese history, despite over 280,000 police officers working the case, despite having more forensic evidence than investigators have ever seen in a single crime, the killer has never been caught. This is the story of the Miyazawa family murders, the most baffling unsolved crime in modern Japan. To understand what happened that night, you need to understand who the Miyazawas were and the world they lived in. Mikio Miyazawa was 44 years old, a dedicated professional working for Interbrand, a London-based marketing company. His colleagues described him as creative, hardworking, someone who took pride in his job. He wasn't wealthy, but he was successful enough to provide a comfortable middle-class life for his family. His wife, Yasuko, was 41. She was a teacher who had left the profession to focus on their 2 children and provide private tutoring from home. Those who knew her said she was kind, patient, the type of person who genuinely cared about others. She had a gentleness that made her students feel safe. Their daughter Nina was 8 years old. She was in 2nd grade, full of energy and curiosity. She played soccer. She did ballet. She had that vibrant personality that made everyone around her smile. And then there was Ray, just 6 years old, the baby of the family, still at that age where the world seemed full of wonder and possibility. The Miyazawas lived in Kamiso Shigeya, a neighborhood in Setagaya Ward in the western suburbs of Tokyo. Their home was part of a small residential area that was slowly being emptied. The Tokyo government had purchased most of the surrounding properties to expand Sashigaya Park, a public recreation space. Houses around them had been demolished one by one. By December 2000, only a handful of homes remained, including the Miyazawa house and the adjacent property where Yasuko's mother Haruko lived. This isolation, this emptiness in what had once been a bustling neighborhood, would become crucial to understanding how the killer operated. There were no close neighbors to hear screams, no one walking by to notice anything unusual. The perfect setting for an attack. Saturday, December 30th, 2000, the last normal day. The Miyazawas went about their routine. Around 6 in the evening, witnesses saw them at a nearby shopping center. They were preparing for New Year's celebrations, buying food and supplies like thousands of other families across Tokyo. But in the days leading up to that Saturday, there had been subtle signs that something wasn't right. 5 days earlier, on Christmas Day, Yasuko had told her father-in-law about something that worried her. She had noticed an unfamiliar car parked repeatedly in front of their house. It wasn't just once or twice. The same vehicle kept appearing. In a neighborhood where everyone knew everyone else's cars, where the nearby park had plenty of parking, This seemed suspicious. Yasuko told family members she felt like someone was watching their home. She was right. On December 27th, 3 days before the murders, a witness reported seeing a man in his 40s walking around the Miyazawa property. Just walking, observing, taking note of the layout, perhaps, the timing of when people came and went. The next day, December 28th, a man dressed in skater-style clothing was spotted at Saijugakuenmi Station, just a few miles from the Miyazawa residence. Witnesses later described him as wearing baggy clothes, the kind popular with young skateboarders at the time. He seemed to be underdressed for December weather, as if he didn't care about the cold or wasn't planning to be outside long. On December 30th, that same man was seen near Sengawa Station, roughly a mile from the Miyazawa home. He was getting closer. There's another detail from the weeks before the murder that investigators found significant. Mikio Miyazawa had gotten into an argument with members of a local motorcycle gang, the Bosuzoku. These are Japanese biker gangs that model themselves after groups like the Hells Angels, loud, aggressive, trying to project toughness. Witnesses saw Mikio confronting them about noise and disruptive behavior. Mikio had also complained to skateboarders who used the nearby park. The park backed right up to the Miyazawa property, and from their second-floor bathroom window, you could look down and see skaters practicing tricks and grinding rails. The noise bothered Mikio. According to people who knew him, he wasn't aggressive about it. He would go out and politely ask them to keep it down. He believed in maintaining order in his neighborhood, but someone didn't appreciate being told what to do. Someone was watching. Someone was planning. That evening, December 30th, Nina visited her grandmother's house next door to watch television. It was the last time anyone outside the family would see any of them alive. Around 10 in the evening, Mikio logged into his password-protected email for the final time. The timestamp, 10:38 p.m. Somewhere around 11 p.m., a passerby near the Miyazawa home heard what sounded like an argument coming from inside the house. Voices raised, something tense and urgent. At approximately 11:30 p.m., Haruko and her family next door heard a loud bang from the Miyazawa house. It wasn't like furniture falling. It was sharp, jarring. They would later tell police they knew it came from the Miyazawa's home because of what was on television at the time. They could pinpoint it based on the TV programming schedule. Around that same time, another witness saw a man hurrying along the walking path beside the Miyazawa property, moving quickly, like someone who didn't want to be seen. Inside the house, a nightmare was beginning. Police would later reconstruct what happened inside the Miyazawa home that night based on the evidence they found. It's a timeline built from blood spatter patterns, the location of bodies, the sequence of wounds, and the physical layout of the house. What they pieced together is horrifying. The killer entered through the second-floor bathroom window at the rear of the house. This window faced Sashigaya Park, the empty green space where most of the neighboring homes had been demolished. There was a fence between the park and the Miyazawa property, but it wasn't difficult to climb. Investigators found tree branches around the fence that had been broken and footprints on the ground beneath the bathroom window. The screen covering the window was torn off and fell to the ground. The intruder climbed through and found himself in the bathroom. From there, he turned right. The first door he encountered led to Ray's bedroom. 6-year-old Ray was asleep in his bed. He never had a chance to understand what was happening. The killer strangled him with his bare hands. No knife, no weapon, just hands around a child's throat until the life drained out of him. This is why police believe Ray died first. He was the only member of the family who wasn't stabbed. His death was different, quieter. The killer's fingerprints were found all over Ray's bedroom, but there was no blood. The violence hadn't escalated yet. Downstairs on the first floor, Mikio was working in his study. He heard something, maybe a thump from upstairs, maybe a muffled cry, maybe just an instinct that something was wrong. He went upstairs to check. At the top of the stairs, Mikio encountered the intruder coming out of Ray's room. What happened next was a fight for survival. Mikio wasn't going to let this person walk away. He fought back. He landed blows. He injured the attacker. But the killer had brought a weapon. A sashimi knife, a long, sharp blade used for cutting raw fish, purchased earlier that day from a supermarket in the Kanagawa Prefecture shopping area. He stabbed Mikio repeatedly. The fight was brutal, desperate. At some point, the blade of the knife broke off. Part of it lodged inside Mikio's skull. Mikio either fell down the stairs or was thrown down. His body was found at the bottom, covered with a drawer. Some investigators believe covering the face indicates the killer knew his victim. Others think it was just a random act by someone trying to process what they'd done. But the killer wasn't finished. Still armed with the broken sashimi knife, he went looking for the others. Yasuko and Nina were upstairs in the third-floor loft bedroom. They heard the commotion. They knew Mikio was in trouble. They likely heard him die. The killer came for them. He attacked with the broken knife, slashing and stabbing. Nina was cut. Yasuko grabbed a first aid kit and tried to treat her daughter's wounds. For a brief moment, she might have thought the killer had left, that they had survived. But he came back. This time, he brought a knife from the Miyazawa's own kitchen. A santoku knife, a multi-purpose blade that Japanese families keep for cutting vegetables and meat. With this weapon, he attacked Yasuko and Nina again. The violence this time was extreme, excessive. Police reports indicate that Yasuko was stabbed so viciously in her chest and head that her bones were visible. Both she and Nina were attacked even after death, with wounds that served no purpose except to release rage. By approximately 11:30 p.m., based on the contents of their stomachs and the evidence at the scene, all 4 members of the Miyazawa family were dead. A father who tried to protect his family, a mother who tried to save her daughter, an 8-year-old girl who never got to grow up, a 6-year-old boy who died confused and terrified. And then the killer did something that has baffled investigators for 24 years. He stayed. In most murders, killers flee the scene immediately. Adrenaline pumping, heart racing. The overwhelming instinct is to get away before someone discovers what you've done. But this killer was different. After murdering 4 people, after the violence, the blood, the broken knife blade lodged in a man's skull, the killer made himself at home. He went to the bathroom and defecated in the Miyazawa's toilet. He didn't flush. When police later analyzed the feces, they discovered he had eaten string beans and sesame seeds the previous day, cheap, common foods popular among young people in Japan. The killer was badly injured from his fight with Mikio. Blood was pouring from wounds on his body. He found the family's first aid kit and tried to bandage himself. When that wasn't enough, he used Yasuko's sanitary napkins to try to stem the bleeding. His blood, type A, was left throughout the house on towels, on feminine products, on surfaces he touched. He went to the kitchen and opened the refrigerator. He ate 4 small containers of ice cream. He drank several bottles of barley tea. He left his saliva on the ice cream cups and the glass. Then he went to the living room and used the family's computer. At 1:18 a.m., while 4 bodies lay dead just meters away, the killer was surfing the internet. Some reports suggest he even tried to book theater tickets online. He rested on their sofa. Investigators found evidence, DNA, blood traces, indicating he had lain down. He may have even taken a nap. At some point, he went through the house systematically. He ransacked rooms, looking for something. He took some of Yasuko's tutoring money, roughly 150,000 yen, about $1,500. But he left nearly 250,000 yen behind. If robbery was the motive, why take some cash and not all? He dumped documents and paperwork into the bathtub. Bank statements, personal papers, items that might tell you about a family's finances or secrets. But investigators could never determine if anything was actually missing. Was he looking for something specific? Or was this just chaos? Before he left, the killer changed his clothes. He had arrived wearing a distinctive outfit, skater brands, baggy style, all carefully documented by the evidence he left behind. But his clothing was now soaked with blood, both his own and the Miyazawa's. He couldn't walk out of the house looking like that, so he took some of Mikio's old clothes, a jacket, probably pants, and then, in an act that makes absolutely no sense, he folded his blood-stained outfit neatly and left it behind. He didn't throw it in a dumpster on the way home. He didn't burn it. He folded it like he was putting away laundry. The killer left through the same second-floor bathroom window he'd entered. Down to the ground, over the fence, into the darkness of Sashigaya Park. It was early morning, December 31st, 2000. The first hours of New Year's Eve. Tokyo was preparing to celebrate the new millennium. And somewhere in that city, a killer was walking free with 4 murders on his hands. He had been in the house for at least 6 hours. Some estimates put it as high as 10 hours. Think about that. 6 to 10 hours sitting in a house with a family you just murdered. Eating their food. Using their belongings. Resting on their furniture. What kind of person does that? December 31st, 2000. Around 11 a.m. Haruko tried calling her daughter's family to make plans for the afternoon. The phone wouldn't connect. No ringtone. Nothing. She walked next door and rang the doorbell. No answer. No sounds of movement inside. Growing worried, she used her spare key and let herself in. What she found would haunt her for the rest of her life. Mikio's body at the bottom of the stairs. Yasuko and Nina upstairs, mutilated beyond recognition. And little Ray, strangled in his bed, his face covered with a futon. Police arrived and began processing what would become one of the most evidence-rich crime scenes in the history of Japanese criminal investigation. Over the following weeks and months, they would collect more than 12,545 pieces of evidence. They would deploy more than 280,000 officers to work on the case. They would track down leads, interview witnesses, and analyze forensics with a level of detail that should have solved the murder within days. But 24 years later, they still don't know who did it. The evidence the killer left behind is staggering. Let's walk through what police found. The clothing tells a story. The killer left a complete outfit folded in the house. A baseball shirt, white with purple sleeves, a rare item with only 130 sold in all of Japan. A black jacket from the Japanese brand Uniqlo, 82,000 sold nationwide. A Crusher hat in a style sold between 1998 and 2000. Gloves made by the Japanese brand Edwin, 26 centimeters in size. A muffler scarf often worn by children or teenagers. 2 black handkerchiefs, both washed and ironed. A detail some investigators connected to military training or a caregiver who maintained clothes meticulously. 1 handkerchief was folded into a triangle with the ends tied, possibly used as a face mask. The other had a 3-centimeter cut in the center, used to wrap the knife handle to prevent slipping. This technique is similar to methods used in fish processing plants and, intriguingly, in certain communities in the northern Philippines where soldiers and gangs wrap knives during rituals. The cologne was Drakkar Noir, a popular men's fragrance made in France and sold in Japan since 1982. It was detected on both the bag and the handkerchiefs. The shoes were the most distinctive piece of evidence. Based on footprints left in blood throughout the house, police determined the killer wore size 27.5 centimeters Slazenger brand running shoes. White sneakers manufactured in South Korea. The size was marked with a Korean size code, KOR 280. No shoes of this size were sold in Japan at the time. The killer either bought them in South Korea or acquired them through import. In the pocket of the sweater, police found traces of bird droppings, Japanese Zelkova tree leaves, and willow leaves, botanical evidence that suggested the killer had been somewhere with specific vegetation before arriving at the Miyazawa house. But the most remarkable piece of evidence was found in the hip bag the killer left behind. Inside were grains of sand, not just any sand. When forensic geologists analyzed it, they determined it came from California. Specifically from areas near Edwards Air Force Base. Edwards Air Force Base is one of the United States' most important military installations. It's where pilots are trained. It's where cutting-edge aerospace technology is tested. And in 2000, there was a significant U.S. military presence in Japan, with bases like Yokotu Air Base located just 40 minutes west of Setagaya. Could the killer have been connected to the U.S. military? A young serviceman who trained at Edwards and was stationed in Japan? The DNA evidence added another layer to the mystery. Blood analysis revealed the killer had type A blood. When advanced DNA profiling became available in 2006, scientists determined that the killer's maternal DNA indicated a mother of European descent, possibly from a Mediterranean or Adriatic region. The paternal DNA indicated a father of East Asian descent. The Y chromosome analysis showed a haplogroup common in Korea, appearing in 1 in 4 or 5 Koreans, 1 in 10 Chinese, and 1 in 13 Japanese. The killer was likely of mixed race, Asian father, European mother, or perhaps a more distant European ancestor on the maternal line. Fingerprints were found throughout the house. The killer's thumbprint had a unique swirl pattern with 2 lines in the center that investigators described as resembling a pig's nose. When they ran this print through Japanese criminal databases, they got no matches. This person had no criminal record. Based on all the evidence, investigators developed a profile. The killer was male, likely between 15 and 35 years old at the time of the murders. By 2018, they revised this down to between 15 and 22 years old based on clothing style and other factors. He was approximately 170 centimeters tall, about 5 feet 6 inches, with a thin, athletic build. He was right-handed. He was physically fit enough to climb a second-floor window and overpower an adult man. Everything pointed to a young man, possibly a teenager, someone of mixed heritage with connections to Korea or Korean products, someone who might have had access to items from a U.S. military base, someone who wore skater fashion and knew techniques from fish processing or military training. It should have been easy to find him. It wasn't. The investigation into the Miyazawa family murders became the largest criminal investigation in Japanese history. Police handed out flyers at train stations every year. They created 3D models of the house to help reconstruct the crime. They interviewed thousands of people. They traced every piece of clothing to the stores where it was sold. The sweater, for example. Police learned that 130 of those specific purple-sleeved baseball shirts had been sold in Tokyo. They tracked down the owners of only 12 of them. The other 118 buyers remain unknown. In December 2021, police announced they had used new technology to visually identify a man who purchased a knife matching the murder weapon at a supermarket on December 30th. They found him on surveillance footage. But when they tracked him down and tested his DNA, it didn't match the killer's. It was the same type of knife, but not the same person. The case became so prominent that it influenced Japanese law. Until 2010, Japan had a statute of limitations on murder, 15 years for most cases, 25 for the most serious. That meant if a killer evaded capture long enough, they could confess freely without being prosecuted. The Miyazawa murders became a driving force for changing that law. The statute of limitations was abolished. Now, no matter how much time passes, the killer can still be charged. So what happened? Why has this person never been found? There are theories, many theories. The money motive suggests the killer was looking for cash from Yasuko's tutoring business or from the sale of the house to the government. But he left most of the money behind, and nothing of significant value was taken. The revenge motive proposes that someone Mikio had confronted skateboarders, Bosuzoku gang members, came back for payback. But murdering an entire family over a noise complaint seems extreme even for the angriest teenager. The hired killer theory suggests someone with a grudge paid a professional to eliminate the Miyazawa family. But what professional killer spends hours at a crime scene eating ice cream? The U.S. military theory has gained attention because of the Edwards Air Force Base sand and the fact that many pilots stationed in Japan train there. Some investigators believe the killer might have been a young man with access to the base, perhaps a dependent, a contractor, or even a serviceman himself. But U.S. military fingerprints weren't widely shared with Japanese law enforcement before September 11th, so if the killer had that connection, it might explain why he's never been identified. The mentally disturbed killer theory suggests someone with psychological issues who killed without a clear motive and behaved bizarrely afterward. But even disturbed killers usually flee crime scenes, and the calculated entry through the bathroom window suggests planning. In 2015, Japanese true crime author Fumiya Ichihashi published a book claiming he had identified the killer, a former South Korean military member he called R. Ichihashi said he had traced soil evidence back to a Korean province where lived and claimed our fingerprints matched those at the crime scene. But despite these claims, no arrest has been made. Some speculate that Ichihashi's identification, if accurate, might involve diplomatic complications between Japan and South Korea. The North Korean theory, occasionally floated in Japanese media, suggests the killer was a North Korean operative who left Japan after the murders. This would explain why there have been no DNA hits, if he's not in any database because he's in North Korea. There's even speculation about a connection to organized crime, the Yakuza, though no evidence supports this. The truth is, investigators don't know. They have more evidence than they've ever had for any crime, and it's led them nowhere. On April 9, 2001, 100 days after the murders, a small Buddhist statue was found near the Miyazawa home along the Sengawa River. It was a Jizo statue, a Buddhist deity that protects children who die before their parents, guiding them safely through the afterlife and keeping them safe from demons. The Chinese character for 6 was carved on the bottom. Police distributed 30,000 flyers with a picture of the statue, thinking perhaps the killer had left it as a sign of remorse. Or maybe someone else placed it there as a memorial. No one knows. 4 years after the murders, the Miyazawa house stood exactly as it had on December 31, 2000. Police preserved it as a crime scene, hoping that new technology or a fresh witness might break the case open. But time takes its toll on everything. By 2019, the structure was deteriorating. The interior showed signs of rot and damage. There was a risk of collapse. Police announced they would demolish the house, assuring the public that all evidence had been preserved and that tearing down the building wouldn't impact the investigation. The family appealed. Setsuko Miyazawa, Mikio's mother, who is now in her 90s, wanted the house to remain standing. As long as it stood, there was hope. As long as the physical reminder remained, people would remember. They would keep talking. Someone might come forward. But the house is gone now. The land remains, patrolled daily by police officers who still hope the killer might return to the scene. Every year, police hold memorial ceremonies at the site. Every year, they hand out new flyers at train stations, appealing for information. The reward stands at 20 million yen, more than $150,000 in US dollars, the largest reward in Japanese history. As of December 2024, 35 officers continue to work the case full-time. They review evidence. They follow up on tips. They wait for advances in DNA technology that might finally give them a break. Because someone out there knows who did this. Maybe it's the killer himself, now in his mid-40s, living with the memories of what he did that night. Maybe it's a family member who noticed something strange. A young man coming home in the early morning hours of December 31st, 2000, wearing clothes that weren't his, injuries he couldn't explain. Maybe it's a friend who heard something in a drunken confession years later. Maybe it's someone who bought that purple-sleeved shirt and still has it tucked away in a closet somewhere. The Miyazawa family murders changed Japan. They exposed the limitations of even the most advanced forensic science when a suspect simply doesn't exist in your databases. They showed that sometimes an overwhelming amount of evidence can be just as frustrating as having none at all. And they left a scar on Japanese society that refuses to heal. In a country known for its safety, where violent crime is rare and murder even rarer, the fact that a family of 4 could be slaughtered in their home and their killer never caught haunts the national consciousness. Mikio Miyazawa, who tried to protect his family until his last breath. Yasuko Miyazawa, who tried desperately to save her daughter's life. Nina, 8 years old, who loved soccer and ballet and never got to grow up. Ray, 6 years old, who died confused and terrified in his own bed. They deserve justice. Their family deserves answers. And somewhere out there, someone knows the truth. If you're listening to this in Lagos right now, maybe you're thinking about your own family. Maybe you're grateful that your doors are locked and your children are safe. Maybe you're wondering how it's possible that with DNA, fingerprints, clothing, and even the killer's feces left as evidence, police still haven't solved this case. The answer is as simple as it is frustrating. If the killer has no criminal record, if his DNA isn't in any database, If his family member's DNA isn't in any database, if he left Japan or went into hiding, then all the evidence in the world means nothing. You need someone to match it against. That's why cases like this rely on human memory, on conscience, on someone, somewhere, deciding that the truth matters more than loyalty or fear. The Miyazawa family murders remain unsolved, but investigations never truly close. Technology improves, databases expand, people get older and their priorities change. Maybe someone who protected the killer in 2000 won't protect him in 2025. Maybe this year will be the year. Maybe someone listening to this story right now will remember something they heard, something they saw, some small detail that never made sense before but suddenly clicks into place. If you have any information about the Miyazawa family murders, you can contact the Tokyo Metropolitan Police at 03-3482-3829. Even the smallest detail might be the missing piece that finally brings justice. Until then, the case remains one of the greatest mysteries in modern criminal history. A family murdered. A killer who stayed for hours. A mountain of evidence. And no answers. Thank you for listening. If you made it this far, please subscribe for more deep dives into true crime's most puzzling cases. And remember, sometimes the most disturbing part of a story isn't the crime itself. It's knowing that the person responsible is still out there, living their life, while the families left behind never stop searching for answers. Sleep well, if you can.